When my husband told me that his father would be moving in with us for a while, I smiled. I said the right words, nodded in agreement, and even offered to prepare the guest room. But something inside me shifted. Not in fear or irritation, but in a strange, dissonant way, like a familiar melody played in the wrong key. I watched him talk on the phone, coordinating the arrival, giving directions, using the same calm tone he used when scheduling a car service. And I realized he didn't ask how I felt about it. Not once. I wasn't surprised, I hadn't been asked how I felt about anything in months. Still, something in that moment pressed too sharply into my chest. Maybe it was the way he said, "It'll just be temporary." As if anything in this house was ever temporary. As if anyone ever truly left. That night, I laid in bed and stared at the ceiling while he turned his back to me and drifted into the kind of sleep only those with an untroubled conscience manage. I couldn't sleep. I traced the cracks in the plaster with my eyes, listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator, and wondered when it happened, when I became invisible. When I stopped being someone worth checking in on. And as the moonlight slipped across our bedroom floor, I knew this visit would change something. Maybe everything. But before I tell you what really happened, before I unfold the days that led me to a choice I never planned to make, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and answer this. Have you ever let something so small go unspoken that it eventually changed your entire life? I was standing in the hallway when he arrived, tall, a little leaner than I remembered, with a worn leather duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked older than last time, but not in the way people mean when they say someone's aged. It was something else. Like the years hadn't just passed through him but etched themselves deep into his posture. I stepped forward to greet him, unsure if a hug would be too much or too little. He made the choice for us, pulling me in briefly, warm, distant, polite. My husband stood behind me, tapping something on his phone as if the arrival of his recently divorced father were just another task to cross off a list. No real sentiment, no long catch-up. Just, you can use the guest room. Wi-Fi passwords on the fridge. Later, while unpacking groceries, I noticed how my husband left the bags for me to carry while he disappeared into the garage, muttering something about checking the water heater. His father stayed behind to help. He didn't say much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. He handed me vegetables one by one, making small comments about the weather, the drive, the cost of tomatoes, trivial things that, for some reason, felt more intimate than they should have. We ended up talking longer than I expected. He asked me how I'd been, really asked, not the autopilot "how are you," but the kind that leaves space for an honest answer. I told him I was tired lately, nothing more. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. That night, we ate together, the three of us at the dining table that had felt too large for two people for years. My husband talked mostly about work, a new project, a colleague's incompetence. I listened, chewing mechanically, watching the way his father barely touched his food, instead looking down at his plate in that way people do when they're thinking too much and trying not to let it show. When I cleared the dishes, he offered to help again. I declined, but he stayed nearby, leaning against the counter. I could feel his eyes on me, not in a heavy, uncomfortable way, but quietly. It had been a long time since I felt someone looking at me like that. Not because they needed something, or expected something. Just looking. I went to bed alone that night. My husband came in late, already in his pajamas, smelling faintly of motor oil. He slid into bed without a word and turned away. I watched his back for a while, then turned to the other side, staring out the window at the bare tree branches casting shadows across the glass. Something had shifted again. I wasn't sure what. Just a small click inside my chest, like a door unlocking. The next morning, I got up earlier than usual. I walked barefoot to the kitchen, expecting silence. Instead, I found his father already there, making coffee. He had a rhythm to him, calm, methodical. He offered me a cup like it was something he'd done 1,000 times. Maybe for his wife, before she left. I accepted, surprised by how natural it felt. We talked again. About simple things. The creaking floorboard near the sink. The old radio I kept on the counter that still played local news. He noticed the photos on the fridge, a picture of my son when he was small, a vacation we took years ago. He asked about them with genuine curiosity, like he wasn't just passing time but actually interested in who we were. That day blurred into errands, emails, the routine I'd perfected over years of quietly managing a household that no longer felt like mine. When I passed the guest room in the afternoon, the door was open. He was inside, sitting on the edge of the bed, reading. I didn't mean to stop and look, but I did. He looked up, and for a second, we just watched each other. Then I smiled and kept walking. My husband didn't come home for dinner. Said he was working late. I didn't ask questions, I'd stopped doing that a long time ago. His father and I ate alone. The conversation stretched farther this time, deeper. He told me about the way the silence had crept into his marriage. How it had built itself like dust, slow and steady, until it coated everything. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, I think I know what that's like. Later, in the bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror. Really looked. The small lines around my eyes, the way my shoulders curved slightly inward. I didn't recognize the woman looking back, but I felt sorry for her. Not because of the years, but because of how long she'd gone unnoticed. That night, I stood outside on the back patio after everyone had gone to sleep. The air was crisp. The sky full of stars I hadn't looked at in months. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stayed out there longer than I meant to, listening to the distant hum of the highway. For once, I didn't feel like a ghost drifting through someone else's home. I didn't know what I was walking toward. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't hoping for anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, maybe everything, had already begun. The following days moved in slow, deliberate waves, like the tide retreating before a storm. I felt it in the way the air shifted when we crossed paths in the hallway, in how his footsteps echoed differently when he walked past the kitchen door. He had a presence that filled the spaces my husband no longer occupied, not forcefully, but fully. Each morning, I would find him already awake, sitting at the small table with his cup of black coffee and the local newspaper folded in half. I stopped pretending to be surprised. It had become routine, our quiet mornings. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just sat in silence, sipping and breathing, like two people who understood the value of sharing a space without forcing it. One morning, he asked about my old job. I hadn't thought about it in years, the consulting work I left behind after our son was born. I told him it was a choice I made willingly, and that wasn't a lie. But something in his eyes told me he understood the second part one didn't say aloud, that sometimes choices come with invisible strings. I noticed the way he paid attention. When I mentioned I liked green tea, it appeared on the counter 2 days later. When I rubbed my shoulder one afternoon, complaining of a dull ache, he asked if I'd been sleeping on my side too much. He wasn't intrusive. He was just aware. And it startled me how much that mattered. My husband, meanwhile, became increasingly absent. Late nights at work, early mornings out the door, short answers, and fewer glances. I stopped asking where he went, and he stopped offering explanations. He existed beside me, like furniture, familiar, necessary, but not alive in the way I needed. It was on a Wednesday afternoon that the first line truly blurred. I had been reorganizing the shelves in the laundry room, trying to distract myself with something productive. He appeared in the doorway, asking if I needed help. I told him no, but he stepped inside anyway, reaching for the box I couldn't quite lift. As he handed it down to me, our fingers touched. Just a moment. But it lingered longer than it should have. My pulse stumbled. I pretended not to notice. So did he. We talked about storage bins and labels. We made it nothing. But it wasn't. That night, I laid in bed wide awake again. My husband snored softly beside me, his back a familiar wall. I thought about the laundry room. About the way his father looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. About how that one simple touch had unraveled something inside me, not because it was inappropriate, but because it made me feel visible. I told myself to stop thinking about it. To stop assigning meaning to fleeting moments. But the next morning, when he handed me my coffee and our hands brushed again, I felt the same electricity spark beneath my skin. And he noticed. I saw it in his hesitation, the way he cleared his throat and looked away too quickly. Later that day, while watering the garden, I caught my reflection in the window. Not just my face, but the way I moved, the way I stood. I didn't look young, and I didn't need to. But for the first time in years, I looked like a woman who was being noticed. Not for what she did or provided, but simply for being. The weather turned warmer by the weekend. My husband announced he'd be out of town for a few days on business. He said it casually, over breakfast, while scrolling through his phone. I nodded. Asked when he'd be back. He shrugged. After he left, the house grew quieter, but not empty. There was something about the way we occupied space without speaking it aloud, like two people balancing on the edge of something unnamed. That evening, we ended up on the back patio, both reaching for the same chair at the same time. Our laughter came too easily. And then it stopped too quickly. I don't remember who leaned in first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was him. But the space between us vanished like mist in the sun, and in its place, heat rose in my chest. His eyes met mine, and I saw questions there, not demands, not expectations. Just questions. We kissed. It happened slowly, without urgency, as if time had opened a pocket for it to unfold naturally. No words followed. Just silence. Breath. The sound of wind through the trees. I stepped back first. Not out of regret, but clarity. The moment had passed, and with it, the certainty of a boundary crossed. He looked at me with a softness that ached. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced the kitchen, drank water I didn't need, opened and closed cabinets as if searching for answers between cereal boxes and spices. I replayed it over and over, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't know what it meant. What it should mean. In the morning, we didn't speak about it. He handed me my coffee like always. I accepted it like always. But something had shifted in the air between us, not heavy, not bitter. Just real. I spent the day moving through tasks without finishing them. I folded laundry but left it on the couch. I washed dishes but forgot to put them away. My mind circled, not with guilt, but with recognition. This was the first time in years I had done something for myself, not to meet someone else's expectations. That evening, I found him in the garage, fixing something he probably didn't need to fix. I stood in the doorway for a while before saying anything. When I did, it wasn't about what had happened. I just asked how he was sleeping. He said better, lately. I didn't ask why. We didn't touch again. Not that day. Not the next. But everything had changed. And deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. The silence that followed was not the cold kind. It wasn't the kind I had grown used to in my marriage, the one that filled rooms with invisible walls. This silence was delicate, almost careful. It asked for space, not distance. After the kiss, we both withdrew in our own ways, not because we were afraid, but because neither of us knew what to do with what had just happened. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual and lingered in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling as light crept through the curtains. I didn't feel shame. I didn't even feel guilt. I felt suspended. Like someone had pressed pause on my life, and I wasn't ready to resume just yet. When I finally stood up, my legs felt heavier, but my chest lighter. In the kitchen, he was already there, like every morning. There was no visible change in his demeanor, but I sensed a new rhythm in his movements. He greeted me with a nod, placed the kettle on the stove, and offered me the same quiet comfort as before. But now, every glance, every gesture, carried an undercurrent we couldn't pretend away. I took my tea to the back porch, needing air, needing space. The early sun warmed the wood beneath my feet, and the breeze carried the scent of newly mown grass. I sat there longer than usual, legs tucked beneath me, hands wrapped around the warm mug. I didn't hear him come out until he sat beside me, not close, not far, the distance of two people who knew they were balancing something fragile. We didn't speak. I think we both knew there were no words that could make sense of anything yet. And in that moment, silence was enough. My husband returned that evening. He came in through the front door, wheeling his small suitcase behind him, his voice louder than necessary as he announced his arrival. I greeted him as I always did, a kiss on the cheek, a polite inquiry about his trip. He gave me vague answers, distracted ones, as he scanned the room like someone checking for rearranged furniture. At dinner, the three of us sat together again. He talked more than usual, cracking jokes, sharing stories from his conference. I laughed in the right places, responded when required, but my eyes rarely met his. His father stayed quiet for the most part, responding politely but without enthusiasm. I could feel the shift in the dynamic, subtle but unmistakable. After the dishes were done, I lingered in the kitchen, drying my hands slowly, listening to the soft murmur of their conversation in the living room. I didn't want to hear what they were saying. I didn't want to read too much into tones and pauses. I just wanted to stop thinking. That night, I lay beside my husband and felt the width of the bed more than ever. He reached for me, his hand resting on my hip like he was trying to remember something. I let him, but my body didn't respond the way it used to. My mind was elsewhere, not in another man's arms, but in the memory of being seen, being spoken to like I mattered. I got up early the next day, made breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, swept the floor, all the things I did to stay in motion. He came in after me, freshly showered, tie already knotted. He kissed my cheek and told me he'd be home late. I nodded. He didn't notice that I didn't smile. Later that afternoon, I found myself reorganizing the hallway closet. It was something I had put off for months, but suddenly it felt necessary. As I pulled out boxes and old shoes, I came across a photo album. One of those heavy leather-bound ones with thick pages and plastic covers that stuck together from age. I sat on the floor and flipped through it. There we were, younger versions of ourselves, smiling on beaches, in restaurants, at weddings. At first glance, we looked happy. But as I looked closer, I noticed how often I was turned slightly toward the camera while he was turned slightly away. How in group shots, his arm rested on my shoulder, not around my waist. It wasn't evidence of anything, just a pattern. A quiet one. I closed the album and slid it back into the closet, brushing the dust from my hands. That evening, he stayed out late again. I didn't ask where he was. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, the television humming softly in the background. His father passed through the room at one point, offering a quiet good night as he retreated to the guest room. I answered with a nod, my fork paused halfway to my mouth. I finished my meal, washed my plate, and stepped outside. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant smoke. I walked barefoot to the edge of the garden, the grass soft beneath my feet. I stood there for a long time, staring up at the sky, trying to remember the last time I had done something purely for myself. When I returned inside, the house felt still in a way that wasn't empty, just waiting. I passed the guest room without looking in, climbed the stairs to my own bedroom, and crawled into bed fully clothed. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the faint creaks of the house settling, each sound a small reminder that life was still happening, even in the pauses. Over the next few days, we resumed our routines. My husband worked. I kept the house. His father helped with repairs, small things around the garden. But the energy had shifted. My awareness of it only grew stronger. I began to notice things. The way my husband would glance at his phone and smile. The sudden messages at dinner that made him excuse himself. The increasing number of working weekends. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. The truth wasn't in the words he said, but in the ones he never bothered to. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, his father came in carrying a box of old tools from the garage. He set them down, then paused, watching me for a moment before speaking. "You've been quiet lately." I looked up and offered a half smile. "I've been thinking." He nodded and didn't press. That was one of the things I had come to appreciate. He didn't force openings, he waited for them. I didn't give him one that day. But I noticed the way his eyes lingered, the way he almost said something more before deciding against it. That night, I sat alone in the dark, lights off, the television on mute. I thought about the kiss, about the way my heart had raced, not from desire alone but from recognition, the kind you feel when someone sees a part of you you thought had been buried. I knew something was coming. I could feel it, not as a threat, but as a truth pushing its way to the surface. And whatever it was, I wasn't sure I was ready. But I also knew I couldn't go back to being invisible. Not anymore. Days folded into one another with a weight I hadn't anticipated. The house, once bustling with the subtle rhythm of family life, now felt like a stage where roles were rehearsed but emotions left unspoken. His father kept to his routines, waking early to tend the garden or work quietly in the garage. His presence was steady, unassuming, but it shifted the atmosphere, pulling at threads of my own suppressed longing. I found myself watching him in moments I thought were unnoticed. How his hands moved with careful precision as he pruned the rose bushes, how his gaze lingered on the horizon beyond the fence, as if seeking something lost. There was a quiet strength in his demeanor, a steadiness that contrasted sharply with my husband's growing absence. My husband, increasingly swallowed by work and indifference, became less a partner and more a fixture, a figure passing through the house with little acknowledgement of my presence. In the mornings, the kitchen became a shared space of silent companionship. We prepared coffee together, the clink of mugs and the hum of the kettle filling the void where conversation had once flourished. Sometimes, he would catch me staring out the window, lost in thoughts I was hesitant to share, and offer a small, knowing smile. That smile sparked something within me, an acknowledgement of unspoken understanding. Yet, the boundaries between us remained fragile and undefined. Our interactions were careful dances around the edges of propriety. I caught myself reaching for moments of connection, a touch on the arm while handing over a dish, a shared glance across the room, small gestures that carried weight far beyond their simplicity. Each instance left me both exhilarated and guilty, a whirlwind of conflicting emotions I struggled to name. One afternoon, while rearranging books on the living room shelf, I accidentally knocked over a small vase. As it teetered, he reached out swiftly, catching it before it shattered. Our hands met briefly, and a shiver traced its way up my spine. We exchanged a glance, unspoken words filling the space between us. I wondered how long this fragile tension could last before it broke, and what the consequences might be. Meanwhile, my husband's detachment deepened. His presence at home was increasingly fleeting, often limited to brief appearances before retreating to his study or escaping out the door. When he was home, he spoke in clipped sentences, avoiding eye contact, leaving me to navigate the growing chasm in silence. I found myself retreating inward, preserving the parts of myself that no longer seemed to have a place in our shared life. One evening, during a rare family dinner, the strain was palpable. My husband's forced smiles and my father-in-law's quiet observation created a tableau of fractured relationships. The conversation was stilted, the topics superficial, carefully avoiding the undercurrents flowing beneath the surface. I sat between them, a silent witness to the unraveling threads of connection. After dinner, as we cleared the table, I noticed the tension in my father-in-law's posture. He seemed weighed down by unspoken thoughts. Later, as he helped me carry dishes to the kitchen, his voice broke the silence. He spoke softly about his own struggles, the loneliness following his divorce, the void left by a life once shared. His words resonated with the ache I carried silently within me. Our shared vulnerabilities created a delicate bridge between us. In those moments, the walls around my guarded heart began to crumble, exposing a yearning I had long suppressed. I realized that what I sought was not simply companionship but understanding, a recognition of my existence beyond the roles assigned to me. Days turned into weeks, and the subtle shifts in our relationship became more pronounced. We found ourselves spending more time together, not out of necessity but choice. Shared walks in the garden, quiet conversations over tea, moments of laughter that broke through the walls of silence. Each interaction deepened the connection, threading a complex tapestry of emotions that defied easy explanation. Yet, amidst these growing bonds, a shadow loomed. I was acutely aware of the fragile boundaries we skirted and the potential fallout should those lines be crossed. The weight of expectation, loyalty, and guilt pressed heavily upon me. I grappled with conflicting desires, the comfort found in genuine connection and the fear of betrayal. One rainy afternoon, while sheltering under the porch, our conversation veered toward the past. He spoke of regrets and lost opportunities with a candidness that stirred something within me. I shared fragments of my own disappointments, the quiet erosion of dreams deferred. Our vulnerability knit us closer, but it also illuminated the chasm between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of the impossible. The days that followed were marked by a cautious intimacy. We navigated the delicate terrain of companionship without crossing into forbidden territory. Yet, every glance, every accidental touch, became laden with meaning. I found myself more conscious of my appearance, selecting clothes with care, aware of how he might perceive me. It was a subtle reclamation of self, a response to the invisibility I had long endured. Meanwhile, my husband remained oblivious or perhaps willfully blind. His absence was no longer a matter of sorrow but of resignation. I stopped seeking his attention, redirecting my energy toward the fragile connection blossoming under the same roof. It was a paradox, feeling seen by the man who was not my husband while my spouse drifted further away. One evening, after the house had settled into its nightly quiet, we found ourselves in the kitchen, sharing a pot of tea. The conversation was light but tinged with an undercurrent of shared understanding. Our hands brushed once again as I reached for the teapot, and this time, neither of us pulled away immediately. In that brief contact, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface became undeniable. I looked up to meet his gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of all our unspoken feelings hung between us. Neither spoke, but in that silence, everything was said. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, caught in the web of my own thoughts, the exhilaration of being noticed, the fear of crossing lines, the aching loneliness that had brought me to this point. I wondered how much longer I could sustain the delicate balance before the inevitable collapse. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains, I resolved to hold on to the moments of connection while I could, knowing full well that the tides were shifting and that change was on the horizon. The question was not if, but when, and what price would be paid. It was a Saturday morning when the air changed. Not in temperature, not in scent, but in texture, the kind of stillness that arrives before something unspoken begins to shift. I woke to the sound of birds outside the window, a soft breeze pushing against the curtains, and the subtle creak of floorboards downstairs. For a moment, I stayed beneath the blanket, staring at the ceiling, unsure of why I felt nervous without reason. Downstairs, the kitchen was quiet. He was already there, as always, coffee in hand, leaning slightly against the counter. He looked up when I entered and gave a small nod, that familiar, unintrusive gesture I had grown to anticipate each morning. I made tea slowly, trying to tame the nervous current moving through me. There was no conversation at first. Just the sounds of the kettle, the occasional clink of a spoon, the rustle of the newspaper. But the silence between us was fuller than usual, thick with the memory of every pause, every glance, every moment we had let linger too long. We stood in it, side by side, like two people waiting for a door to open that neither dared to touch. Later, we ended up in the garage, sorting through old boxes my husband had once promised to organize. It was an ordinary task, one that should have felt mundane. But every movement, the passing of tools, the lifting of lids, the brushing of dust from forgotten items, felt purposeful, like a language being spoken without words. He handed me a box too heavy for me to lift alone, and our hands met again. Not accidentally this time. His fingers closed around mine for a brief moment, deliberate, firm, warm. I looked up, and so did he. And for a second, I forgot to breathe. We kissed. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It didn't come with declarations or apologies. It was quiet. Natural. The culmination of weeks of conversations, silence, glances, and shared loneliness. It didn't feel wrong, only inevitable. And when it ended, we didn't pull away in shock or guilt. We simply stood there, letting the moment settle into the room like dust in sunlight. I turned first. I needed air. I stepped outside into the sunlight, walking toward the garden without looking back. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, not from panic, but from a strange, heavy clarity. I sat on the bench by the rosemary bush and closed my eyes. My breath came in long, controlled waves. I was aware of everything, the scent of the earth, the warmth of the stone beneath me, the echo of that kiss still playing on my lips. When I came back inside, he was gone from the garage, and I heard the soft hum of the shower upstairs. I didn't seek him out. I didn't know what I would say. Instead, I went about the afternoon as if everything were unchanged, though I knew it wasn't. My husband returned home earlier than expected that evening. He came through the front door with the sound of keys tossed on the table, his voice calling out a casual greeting. I responded from the kitchen, my voice steadier than I felt. He walked in, gave me a kiss on the cheek, and asked what was for dinner. Everything about the moment felt surreal. I answered calmly, mentioned something about leftovers, and watched as he opened the fridge and took a beer. He didn't notice my hesitation. He never did. We sat down at the table, the three of us, and ate a quiet meal. He talked about work, about a colleague's mistake and how he had to fix it. I nodded where appropriate. His father barely spoke, only adding a comment here and there, his eyes lowered to his plate. I didn't know if it was discomfort or guilt or just fatigue, but I recognized in his silence the same storm I felt brewing inside myself. After dinner, I volunteered to wash the dishes. My husband left the kitchen without offering to help, already preoccupied with his phone, probably retreating to the study to answer messages I would never see. His father stayed behind for a moment, drying the dishes I handed him, his movements quiet and deliberate. When the last plate was placed on the rack, he paused and turned slightly toward me. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, I'd see too much of him, of myself, of what we'd just done. Thank you, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. He left without another word. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling once again, the shadows from the window stretching across the walls like fingers. My husband was beside me, already asleep. I listened to his breathing, slow and even, and wondered when I had stopped hearing it. When it had turned from comfort to background noise. I thought about what had happened in the garage. I replayed the moment over and over, not because I doubted it, but because I didn't know what to do with it. It had been real, undeniable. And it had not been impulsive. It had come from something slow and deeply buried, something that had taken root long before I had the courage to notice. The next morning, nothing outwardly changed. The routines resumed. Breakfast, news, chores, errands. But I carried the weight of that kiss with me in every step, every breath. I noticed the way he avoided being alone with me, the way he filled his time with tasks, the way he avoided my eyes. I did the same. We were two people suspended between what had already happened and what we couldn't allow to happen again. And yet, I didn't regret it. That was the part that shook me the most. I didn't regret it. Not the moment itself, not the feeling, not the tenderness that passed between us. What I regretted was everything that led to it, the years of silence, the erosion of love, the loneliness I had convinced myself was normal. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't have a plan. But I knew that something had shifted inside me. Something I couldn't put back. And I also knew that the life I had accepted for so long, the half-seen, half-felt existence, would never be enough again. Not now. Not after being reminded, even briefly, of what it felt like to be truly present. To be truly seen. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm, but the undercurrent beneath them had changed completely. I moved through the house like someone walking across thin ice, calm on the outside, careful with every step, constantly aware of what was below. Nothing between us had been spoken of since that day in the garage, but the silence held too much weight to be ordinary. He avoided me in the subtlest ways. If I entered a room, he'd excuse himself a moment later. If I spoke, his replies were measured, brief, always polite. And yet, I caught him watching me more than once, in the hallway, across the kitchen table, even from the garden while I watered the plants. There was something in his expression I couldn't name. Not regret exactly, but restraint. A deliberate holding back, as though he feared what more might come if we didn't put space between us. I tried to do the same. I focused on small things, reorganizing drawers, deep cleaning corners of the house no one noticed, folding towels more precisely than necessary. But no task could distract me completely. My mind returned to the memory of that kiss over and over again, not to indulge in fantasy, but to examine it, to understand why it had meant so much, why it hadn't felt like a mistake. It wasn't passion that lingered with me. It was clarity. For the first time in years, someone had made me feel not just seen, but recognized. Not as a role, wife, mother, host, but as a person with a pulse and a history and a presence that mattered. The tension in the house thickened with each passing day, especially in the evenings when all three of us were under the same roof. My husband seemed unaffected, or at least uninterested. He remained buried in his work, or his phone, or his silence. He didn't ask questions. If he noticed the growing awkwardness between his father and me, he didn't let on. But I noticed something else, a new sort of attentiveness from him. Not emotional, not affectionate. It was subtle. He began observing things more closely. He asked where I'd been, what I'd done during the day, in ways that felt more like inventory than conversation. He smiled more often at dinner, as if trying to re-establish control without showing his hand. It made me uncomfortable, but I told myself I was imagining it. Then one afternoon, something shifted. I was in the pantry, organizing the shelves, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting him, but it was his father. He paused in the doorway, as if surprised to see me, and I knew instantly he had come looking for something else, or perhaps to escape being looked at. We stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in. Then he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, not looking at me. I waited. He took a slow breath, eyes on a crack in the floor. "That kiss. It shouldn't have happened," he said, his voice firm, but not cold. "You deserve more than confusion. And I'm not sure I have anything to offer you that wouldn't complicate your life." I felt my chest tighten. Not because I disagreed, but because it hurt to hear it put into words. Not rejection, not anger, just a quiet truth I didn't know how to challenge. "I understand," I said softly. He nodded, then turned to leave. But before he crossed the threshold, he looked back, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in days. "I just wanted you to know," he said. "It meant something to me." And then he was gone. I stood in the pantry for a long time after that, staring at cans of soup, boxes of rice, jars of jam that hadn't been opened in months. Trying to anchor myself to the simplicity of shelves and labels when my heart felt like it was balancing on the edge of something much less certain. That evening, I didn't mention the conversation. I sat through dinner, nodded through my husband's half-hearted remarks about work, listened to the ticking of the wall clock. Everything moved as if nothing had changed, as if we were three strangers living in a house of habits. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something had changed. Not just between him and me, but inside me. For years, I had allowed myself to live in a slow fade, dimming my voice, my needs, my very self. That kiss had illuminated the absence. And the conversation in the pantry had confirmed it. I didn't know what to do with the knowledge yet. I didn't have a plan or a solution. But I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. Not to him. Not to myself. I had spent too many years convincing myself that a quiet life was the same as a good one. The next morning, I rose early and sat at the kitchen table long before either of them came downstairs. I drank my tea slowly, staring out the window, letting the early light paint the cabinets in soft gold. I thought about what I wanted, not in abstract terms, but real ones. I didn't want secrets. I didn't want scandal. I just wanted to feel whole again. When my husband came down, he greeted me with a distracted kiss on the cheek and poured himself coffee. He didn't notice that I had already cleaned the whole kitchen. He didn't ask how I slept. He didn't see the shift in my posture, the way I held the cup in both hands as if grounding myself. But his father did. When he entered the room, our eyes met for just a second. No words passed between us. But I knew he saw it too, that we had crossed a threshold we couldn't uncross, even if we never touched again. The day passed quietly. My husband left for work, the house returned to its usual stillness, and I moved through it with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I folded laundry, called a friend I hadn't spoken to in a while, sat in the sun on the back steps. And when the evening came, I found myself in the garden. Not hiding. Not waiting. Just being. I dug my hands into the soil, planting late-season herbs, breathing in the scent of earth and rosemary. I felt the wind lift the hair from my neck, the cool air press against my skin. And in that moment, I let go of the question that had haunted me for weeks. What happens next? I didn't need the answer yet. It would come in time. But for now, I was done apologizing for needing something more than silence. The house was unusually quiet the day my husband announced he would be leaving again for the weekend. He said it as he buttoned his shirt, checking his reflection in the mirror without looking at me. His tone was casual, almost offhand, like he was informing me of a change in the weather, not his own prolonged absence. I didn't ask where he was going. I no longer asked those questions. The answers rarely mattered, and when they did, they only confirmed what I already knew. He left just after noon, suitcase in hand, car pulling away without so much as a wave. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the empty driveway, then turned back toward the kitchen and poured myself another cup of tea. The silence in the house after his departure felt different this time, not empty, but available. Like something was waiting to unfold. His father was out in the backyard, tending to the garden with deliberate care. From the window, I could see him kneeling by the tomatoes, his hands buried in the soil. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms streaked with dirt. He moved slowly, purposefully, and something about the way he touched the plants, gently but confidently, made my chest tighten. I joined him outside not long after, carrying a bowl of clippings for compost. We didn't speak at first. We worked in silence, side by side, pulling weeds, trimming stems, adjusting the netting over the beans. It was a hot day, but the air held a soft breeze, and the sky above us was a clean, uninterrupted blue. I became aware of my own breathing, how it matched his rhythm, and of how often our hands came close without quite touching. When we finally sat down on the patio, I brought out 2 glasses of water. He thanked me with a nod. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting everything in long shadows and a honeyed glow. I felt its warmth on my skin, but I also felt something else, a pressure in my chest, like something unsaid was ready to rise. We talked, at first, about simple things. The garden. The weather. An old movie we both remembered from years ago. The kind of conversation that circles around meaning without landing on it. But then the pauses grew longer, and the spaces between words became heavy again. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a question he didn't ask aloud. One I had been asking myself for days. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. Instead, I stood up slowly and said I was going to the store. He offered to come along, and I said yes, not because I needed help, but because I couldn't bear the idea of being alone with everything sitting inside me. The ride to the store was quiet. The windows were down, the wind threading through my hair. We didn't speak, and yet the silence wasn't empty. It was charged. Something unspoken lived in the space between us, a knowledge we were both aware of but had no plan for. Inside the store, we moved through the aisles like any 2 people shopping together, bread, fruit, paper towels. But every brush of his arm, every glance exchanged over a cart handle, carried a weight that groceries could not distract from. I reached for a jar on the top shelf, and he stepped in to help, his hand closing over mine for just a second too long. I pulled back gently, but not without noticing the sharp intake of breath that followed. On the drive home, I kept the window open and let the wind rush over me. I wanted to feel grounded, wanted something real to anchor me. The hum of the tires on the road, the rhythm of turns and stops, the simplicity of motion, they offered a kind of calm I hadn't felt in days. But the closer we got to the house, the more I could feel the weight returning. Back inside, we unpacked the groceries in silence. I placed the apples in the bowl, stacked the boxes, slid the milk into the fridge. He handed things to me without speaking. I took them without looking. Our hands brushed once more, and we both froze. This time, there was no step backward. We stood still, the refrigerator door still open behind me, cold air slipping past my arm. He looked at me, and I looked back. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just breathed. We spent the night together. No words were needed after that. We parted in the hallway, like we always did, and he disappeared into the guest room while I walked back up the stairs. My bedroom was still and untouched, the bed made, the sheets smoothed by the afternoon sun. I sat on the edge for a long time, staring at the wall, the ticking of the clock on the dresser steady and indifferent. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I didn't ask myself what it meant or what would happen next. I simply sat there, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest, not like a burden, but like a new truth. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the ceiling slowly lose its definition in the darkness. I traced the pattern of shadows cast by the moonlight and listened to the silence that filled the room. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't painful. It just was. In the morning, I woke early. I washed my face, brushed my hair, and moved through the motions of routine like someone stepping into a new version of their life. I didn't feel transformed. I felt real. As if something hidden had finally been acknowledged, and in doing so, had changed shape. He was in the kitchen, already dressed, already making coffee. He looked at me when I entered but didn't speak. I didn't speak either. I poured my tea, stirred it slowly, and sat across from him. We drank in silence. Something had broken open. And something had begun. Neither of us knew what came next. But neither of us turned away. The morning after was ordinary in all the ways it shouldn't have been. The sun filtered through the windows with the same pale softness as always. The kettle on the stove let out its familiar hiss. The floorboards creaked in the same spots. But underneath it all was a hum, subtle, constant, undeniable, like a low note in a song only I could hear. I moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, pouring hot water into my mug, stirring sugar into my tea. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. But my body carried a strange tension, like I was waiting for something that hadn't yet arrived. He sat across from me, quiet as always, but the silence between us had changed. It was no longer a gentle absence of sound. It was filled with things we hadn't said, things we couldn't take back. He didn't look at me often, but when he did, his gaze was steady, grounded, and far too knowing. I wondered if he felt the same, not guilt, not fear, but inevitability. As though we had stepped into a moment we had both been moving toward for longer than we realized. He helped with the dishes. We didn't speak. Our fingers didn't touch. And when he left the kitchen, I stood at the sink for several minutes after the water had stopped running, staring through the window at the garden, unsure if I felt like someone who had made a mistake or someone who had simply stopped lying to herself. It was early afternoon when my husband returned. I hadn't expected him. I heard the engine in the driveway, the car door, the sound of keys jangling. He entered the house with the kind of cheerfulness that always felt slightly forced, announcing his arrival like someone hoping for applause. I met him in the hallway, and he greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a bright, "I came back early. Thought I'd surprise you." I smiled. Or at least, I lifted the corners of my mouth in what resembled a smile. "You did," I said. He carried his suitcase upstairs without asking for help, talking as he went, about the drive, the hotel, something amusing that had happened at dinner the night before. I listened, nodding occasionally, letting his words fill the space I was no longer interested in inhabiting. Later, at dinner, the three of us sat at the table again. The conversation was light, led mostly by my husband, who seemed in unusually good spirits. He asked his father how things had been while he was gone, and I noticed the way he paused before answering. "Quiet," he said. "Peaceful." I caught the briefest flicker in my husband's eyes. Something passed there, not quite suspicion, not yet. But something. When I cleared the dishes, my husband followed me into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. He watched me for a while before speaking. "You seem different," he said. "Did something happen while I was away?" I kept my back to him, rinsing the plates, my hands steady. "No," I said. Nothing happened. He didn't press. He never did when it might mean confronting something uncomfortable. He just hummed and walked away, and I let the sound of running water carry away the lie I had just told. That night, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I stared at my reflection, searching for evidence of change. My face looked the same. My body carried the same lines, the same quiet aging. But something had shifted in my expression, a stillness I hadn't noticed before. A resignation. A quiet knowing. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee before anyone else was awake. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a sweater, watching the sky move from gray to gold. The silence was comforting, not heavy. I let it stretch around me like a soft wall. A place where nothing needed to be explained. Eventually, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew who it was. He sat beside me without a word, his presence as familiar now as the furniture on the porch. We didn't speak for several minutes. There was no need. "I'm not proud," he said finally. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "But I don't regret it either." I nodded. I didn't speak. "Do you?" he asked. I thought about it. Really thought. I considered the silence in my marriage, the endless giving with no return, the slow erasure of self that had become my routine. I thought about the garden, the shared glances, the night that had unfolded not from passion but from recognition. "No," I said. "I don't." He looked out toward the trees. The sun was fully up now, casting shadows across the lawn. "We can't go back," he said. "I know." We didn't talk about what would come next. There was no plan, no strategy. Only acknowledgement and the quiet grief that came with it. That day, I moved through my chores with unusual focus. I scrubbed the baseboards, wiped down cabinets, swept under the rugs. I wanted to feel tired. I wanted to feel something physical and simple and honest. But everything I did only made me more aware of what had already been set in motion. My husband spent most of the day in his study, emerging only occasionally to check his phone or refill his coffee. He didn't ask me to sit with him, didn't wonder aloud about dinner. He was physically present, but absent in every other way. That evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, I found myself staring at one of his shirts. A simple blue button-down, one he wore often. I held it in my hands for a long time, remembering how it used to smell faintly of cologne and fresh air. Now it smelled like nothing. Fabric and detergent. Like someone had already left it behind. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. That night, I didn't go to bed right away. I sat on the back porch again, letting the night wrap around me, the cool air brushing against my arms. I thought about choices. About timing. About how life never changes in one big moment, but in a collection of small ones, stacked quietly until something finally gives. And something had given. I didn't know what would follow. I didn't know what I wanted, not exactly. But I knew I couldn't keep living in a silence that had become so loud it drowned out everything else. The wind picked up. The trees whispered. And in the stillness, I realized I was finally listening. The days that followed moved slowly, like walking through water. Each one carried a sense of heaviness I hadn't expected, not from guilt, but from the weight of knowing what couldn't be undone. I had lived so long inside quiet routines, invisible compromises, and unspoken loneliness that the shift in my reality left me both alert and adrift. My husband remained absorbed in his own orbit. He asked fewer questions, if that was even possible. He came and went with increasing irregularity, offering explanations I didn't request and gestures of affection that felt more like performance than sincerity. I played my part, but the script had worn thin. I could feel it in my posture, in my breath, in the silence that now pressed harder than ever before. He didn't notice the way I avoided eye contact. He didn't notice that I rarely laughed anymore. Or maybe he did, and chose not to acknowledge it, as though naming it might force him to confront something he couldn't control. His father, meanwhile, became more reserved. We moved through the same spaces, but we rarely exchanged words. The few times we did, it was careful about groceries, schedules, weather. The intimacy of our silences had shifted into something more distant, more deliberate. Not cold, but cautious. A silent agreement to create space where closeness had once grown. And yet, the awareness between us remained. A quiet thread connecting one glance to the next, one step to the next. It was the kind of tension that didn't require words, that lived in the things we chose not to say. One morning, while folding laundry in the guest room, I found myself holding one of his shirts. I stared at it for a long time, the fabric soft from wear, the scent of him barely lingering. It wasn't longing I felt. It was something quieter, heavier. Like a question left unanswered, or a chapter unfinished. That afternoon, I went for a walk. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving, didn't take my phone. I just needed air, movement, space. The neighborhood was quiet, the sidewalks mostly empty. I passed familiar houses with familiar gardens, dogs barking behind fences, wind rustling through trees that were beginning to shed their summer green. I walked until my legs ached, then sat on a park bench beneath a row of oaks. I watched the leaves move, slow and rhythmic, and thought about time, how it had passed without my noticing, how easily life could blur into routine. I thought about the woman I had once imagined I'd become. I wasn't sure if I was her anymore. I wasn't sure if I ever had been. When I returned home, the house felt heavier. I knew before I walked inside that something was different. It wasn't anything visible. Everything was in its place. But the air had shifted, thick, expectant. My husband was sitting at the kitchen table. His expression was unreadable. Not angry, not sad, just still. He looked up when I entered and said nothing for a moment. Then, with a voice so casual it made my skin prickle, he asked, "Did you enjoy your walk?" I nodded. Yes. He watched me for a second longer, then turned back to his coffee, lifting the mug with both hands like it took effort. That evening, the three of us ate dinner in near silence. The clatter of cutlery echoed too loudly in the quiet. My husband's glances were sharper than usual, less distracted. I felt them land like small taps on glass, probing for cracks. I excused myself early, claiming a headache. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap, unmoving. My mind raced, but my body stayed still. I didn't know what was coming. But I knew something was. The ground beneath me was shifting, subtly, steadily. The next morning, I found an envelope on the kitchen table. No name. Just my name written in my husband's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly typed, folded with precision. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an accusation. It was a list. Dates. Times. Locations. Nothing dramatic. Just observations. Notes. A record of moments I hadn't realized had been watched. He had known. Not everything. But enough. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I sat down and read it twice. Then I folded it back into the envelope and placed it on the counter. I knew what it meant, though he hadn't said it aloud. This wasn't an explosion. It was a preparation. A lining up of pieces. A slow, methodical way of saying, I've been paying attention now. I'm not looking away anymore. The silence between us that evening was different. It was no longer passive. It was waiting. The next day, he left early. No explanation. No comment. I watched from the window as his car pulled away, and for the first time, I felt something unexpected, relief. When I turned around, his father stood at the base of the stairs. Our eyes met, and I saw it in his face, he knew too. Or at least, he suspected. There was a tension in his jaw I hadn't seen before. His eyes held a kind of quiet dread. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again. Then, finally, with barely a whisper, "Did something happen?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I stepped past him and walked out into the backyard. The garden was quiet. Overgrown in places. Neglected in others. I picked up the shears and began trimming, not because it needed doing, but because I needed something to hold. Each snip of the blade felt like an answer. Not to his question, not to my husband's silence, but to myself. A confirmation that what had been hidden was no longer hiding. That whatever had been growing, beneath the surface, between the lines, had come into full view. By sunset, the garden looked cleaner. Less wild. But not perfect. I stood there as the light faded, the shears still in my hand, the scent of cut stems in the air. I knew there would be consequences. I knew the silence would soon end. But for now, I stood still. And I waited. The morning after I found the envelope, I woke earlier than usual. The room was still shadowed, the air cool against my skin. I sat on the edge of the bed, feet planted on the floor, hands resting limply in my lap. For a few minutes, I just sat there unmoving, untouched by purpose. Then I stood, washed my face, tied back my hair, and got dressed. My body moved like it had somewhere to go, even if my mind hadn't caught up yet. Downstairs, the house was quiet. The kitchen held the faint scent of last night's tea. A single coffee cup sat in the sink, as if someone had started the day without finishing it. I looked at it for a long moment before setting the kettle to boil. I wasn't sure if I wanted tea. I just knew I needed to do something with my hands. The envelope was gone. It had been left on the kitchen table the day before, and now it wasn't there. I didn't ask where it had gone. I didn't need to. The message had already been received, not in words, but in what was left unsaid. I sat at the table with my tea and stared at the garden. It looked calmer than I felt, overcast light softening the edges of everything, the soil still damp from yesterday's trimming. I could still feel the shears in my hand, the way each cut had felt like a decision. Final. Quiet. Precise. He entered the room without a sound. His footsteps were light, careful. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the sink, back turned. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Eventually, he did. "He knows," he said. His voice wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even surprised. It was just accepting. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes on the window. "I think he's known for a while." He sat down across from me, setting the glass down with a soft clink. For a few seconds, we sat in silence. Not the kind we used to share. This one was heavier. Denser. More final. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he said. "I didn't either. But we did." Yes. We didn't cry. We didn't reach for each other. Whatever tenderness had once passed between us was now wrapped tightly in consequence. The moment had passed. Not because the feeling was gone, but because the world had shifted around it, like walls closing in after a door has been left open too long. My husband returned later that evening. He didn't greet me. Didn't say anything at all. He walked in, set his keys on the counter, and stood in the hallway like he was waiting for something. I looked at him from the kitchen doorway, and for a long time, we just stared at each other. There was no confrontation. No dramatic unraveling. Just two people standing in the wreckage of something that had been quietly falling apart for years. Finally, he walked past me and went upstairs. I heard drawers opening, closet doors creaking, the soft thud of luggage pulled from under the bed. He came down with a suitcase in one hand and a folded blazer draped over his arm. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight," he said. His voice was flat, expression unreadable. I nodded. "Okay. Lawyer will be in touch next week." "Okay." He paused, then added, "You don't need to explain anything. I saw enough." And with that, he walked out the door. No raised voices. No accusations. Just the sound of shoes on hardwood and a door clicking shut. I stood in the silence that followed and let it settle over me. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I didn't even move. I felt everything and nothing at once: grief, relief, guilt, clarity. It all swirled together, quiet and steady like a slow-moving storm that had already passed. I spent the evening cleaning. Not frantically, not for distraction. Just methodically. I wiped down counters, emptied drawers, donated clothes that no longer felt like mine. I moved through the house not as someone escaping, but as someone making space. The next few days blurred into a quiet unraveling. Papers arrived. Emails were exchanged. Appointments made. We didn't speak after that night. He never returned to the house. I found out through mutual friends that he had already moved in with someone else, a woman from work. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It made sense. Too much sense. The morning the final papers arrived, I signed them without ceremony. Just my name on a line, like I was signing for a package I hadn't ordered but accepted anyway. His father left soon after. He didn't say goodbye in the traditional sense. He packed his things over 2 days, folded and stacked with care. On his last morning, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen while I poured my tea. "I should go," he said. I nodded. "I know." He looked tired. Not in the physical way, but in the quiet, emotional way that comes after too much has been said without words. "I hope you'll be okay," he said. "I already am." He studied me for a moment, as if seeing something he hadn't before, or maybe just finally recognizing that I wasn't his to fix. Then he left. No promises. No confessions. Just a final silence that felt more like an ending than any goodbye ever could. After he was gone, I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out at the garden. It had begun to grow wild again. I knew I should trim it, pull the weeds, restore the order. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I sat at the table with my tea, the same way I had so many mornings before. But this time, the silence didn't press in on me. It gave me space. Room to breathe. I wasn't broken. I wasn't whole. I was simply beginning again, in a house that had held so much silence, so much longing, so much of me that I had once forgotten. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to explain anything to anyone. Not even myself.